different kinds of colonized people, sometimes like I just would assume like, oh no, okay, like I've said the form, so we can move on and begin
Yeah,
the speech,
yeah.
like the intramural speech. But I found like, oh, that's not true. I think discerning what that form is that is producing that feeling of constraint is maybe a lot of people's relationship to
Mm,
the aesthetic.
mm. Well, hello, 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 world. Jamil Aule Kasako here. Jamil means beauty. And I am coming to you loud, live, in color, and excited to share this conversation with someone who I've been thinking with, working with for at least 6 years now. Probably one of the smartest people I know.
Who's smarter than me? Why
I
didn't
mean,
you say the
right,
smartest?
exactly.
Give me the
Wait
list.
a minute. Wait a minute.
I would like to know who I need to be studying.
But literally, yes, one of the smartest folks that I've encountered, yeah, in my life, really. The Dahlia Li, Professor Dr. Lee, Dr. Lee,
Yeah,
newly
doctor.
minted,
Newly minted.
Dr. Lee.
Since almost exactly a year ago.
I mean, hot damn.
Cheers.
Cheers to that. I want to read some Dahlia lyrics.
We'll send it privately. Like,
I want to know about like 23, 24-year-old Dahlia.
there's like, I've been looking back on some of them as I'm writing the new poems to be able to
Yeah.
assess, like, well, what is the difference across a decade
Yeah,
in
yeah.
returning to writing? And some of them do feel like they were just exercises in form that were really like, I don't want to say just clever, but they were exploring what can language do. So when I was writing poetry, really bad at free verse.
Mm, mm.
Um, and my favorite
You seem
forms.
like you need, not that you need
Yeah, no, no, no. I work
form,
best under
but
this. You know me. No, you know me. So then, of course, it wasn't just like, oh, write in like rhyming
yeah,
couplets or like write sonnets. It was
yeah,
like
yeah.
sestinas
Okay,
and double
exactly.
dactyls. And the
Yeah,
closest I could get to like a more free verse or abstract lyric was when I was writing more ekphrastic poetry.
okay.
And then that wasn't really free verse. It was just like I'm borrowing the form that I see from the
Yeah.
particular artwork that I'm
Oh,
writing about.
so interesting. I mean, because for me, so much of the poetic was discovering the form
Mm-hmm.
that was kind of the best vessel for the lyric, if you
Mm-hmm.
will. Like that kind of, arithmetic or calculus was like so interesting to me. Yeah, form just felt like, I mean, I failed the sonnet, so it was like,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
what's a form? Back off.
Yeah.
um, but yeah, okay, so
I mean, I think
interesting.
why I couldn't do like free verse was my relationship to the lyric was
Mm-hmm.
already so formally constrained. English was my second language. I remember learning English with my mom when I was like 4 before preschool, and we were just reading Dr. Seuss together.
Mm.
And then I was like forced to play classical piano for 10 years. So, like, there is a realm in which the abstract lyric exists for me, but I actually find that's most accessible through dance, not through language, because I think I always experience language as a certain kind of imposition
Mm.
because English is not my first language, and I don't come from like a lived background from my younger years where there was like much of a creative retooling of a colonizer's language in the way that like understanding African American poetry, like that's what's so beautiful about it is like there is a concentrated attempt to take that particular mode of imposition and to riff on it. But I don't have that language experience of riffing on. And so if I were to try to, even when I did try to do abstract lyric, I would just find myself going like, I think I'm just, if I'm not trying to imitate like annoying white men, that it doesn't work. Like, then it would be like, well, now I'm trying to imitate what I understand a certain kind of US based black lyric to be doing. And I was like, that also doesn't
Not
feel
quite right.
quite it. So I actually think now I've been able to return to poetry as like having studied a variety of feminist writing. So it's now with like a different relationship to language that I can reapproach
And your own
poetry
voice.
and my
I
own
think,
voice. That's
you
also
know?
that's definitely part of it. I mean, it's like one needs one's own voice to write. Whatever,
I would imagine.
whatever.
Right. I mean, you seem so. I mean, well, you've always uh, have seemed so self-realized.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like you are able to sort of pinpoint, well, yeah, because of X, Y, Z, elemental P. And I mean, I all like whenever you speak, I am so fascinated with that because it seems like you just you automatically kind of are able to make a summation or I don't know if only an opinion or like a very educated hypothesis as to like what is happening in a thing. And yeah, I just find that like it's so fascinating to
Well, I
me.
think that is also a poet's thing that I do because it's about the study of form. And I think what
So
can
like what's
be,
the formations
yeah,
happening?
like what can be a little, I don't know if the word is like frustrating or confusing. I think when I was younger, it was confusing.
Yeah.
Was like I assumed that like one encounters something that's really intense or confusing, and the first thing one does is then figure out what is its form.
Mm.
So then you speak it, and the
Mm.
reason we speak the form is so then we begin departures from the form.
Mm-hmm.
But then, particularly at a place like Princeton, or if you're like amongst different kinds of colonized people, sometimes like I just would assume like, oh no, okay, like I've said the form, so we can move on and begin
Yeah,
the speech,
yeah.
like the intramural speech. But I found like, oh, that's not true. I think discerning what that form is that is producing that feeling of constraint is maybe a lot of people's relationship to the aesthetic, or to inquiry,
Mm-hmm.
which I actually think is not mine, which maybe is why it appears weird or fascinating to other people, because one would
Yeah.
assume based off of how I speak or analyze that like that's the thing that I want to do.
Yeah,
But actually
yeah.
the purpose in me delineating those things is like, okay, now that we know the house that we're in, what do
Yeah.
we want to do?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. How many languages do you speak?
Well, five. I grew up
Wow.
speaking Mandarin Chinese. I like
Okay.
actually can understand some Cantonese.
Okay.
My parents didn't teach me that, but both of my parents speak it. The region where dad's family is from. Well, actually, my dad's family just prefers Cantonese. And then English, and then in middle school I learned Spanish, and that was really refined by working with Spanish-speaking people in my parents' restaurants.
Mm.
And then I think in high school I just really liked language, so then I picked up French. And then I was doing a little bit of
Switched it up.
Latin. And then I was a nerd and like went to Arabic language camp one summer. And then in college I learned Italian. So the ones that I actually have like enough reading and writing and speaking to like do things with would
Yeah.
be like English, Mandarin, French, Italian, Spanish.
Okay.
I generally have a sense of what's going on with Latin, and then Arabic is like really rudimentary. And I know some really good, basically Valley Girl,
Mm.
modern Greek.
Okay. I love that cosmology. That is incredible because
And I
Yeah.
know enough Sanskrit to get through like
A good yoga.
most of Ashtanga. This is the like first and second series of Ashtanga yoga, and yeah,
I
and a
love
couple
it.
chants.
Hey. Well, okay, so on that note, chanting specifically, I'm curious, like, what is sort of, on your spirit, or, what have you been sort of thinking about? What's been the focus of, maybe your poetic inquiry right now?
Mm. Mostly Fury, actually. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you know some of this.
I'm pissed.
Yeah, I've been feeling very toyed with by a number of things. And some of that's like malicious, some of that is just like that we let people get away with things. Some other parts of it that are that like there's just a normalization
Yeah.
of uncaring. Let's not
Mm-hmm.
even call it violence because I
Exactly.
think that makes it seem a little bit more intentional or like concrete when I'm like, oh, I think this is simply just uncarefulness.
Mm, mm,
So it's on my spirit. I think on my spirit is a lot of then considering if that's the reality that we're in and that much language is being put out towards naming the apparatus, the violence or dispossession. I worry then
mm,
at like a broader cultural level, but also at an urgent interior for me level, then what is the space that's not outside of that violence or outside of that dispossession or outside of that uncaring, but do we cede all of that space then to critique only? So I'm finding in a lot of my
mm,
writing across poetry and um, critical lyric, which maybe that's what I consider like the non-poet, like the explicit critical lyric, and even in what I'm exploring in dance is sort of like, so what are the spaces that the Black feminist historian Darlene Clark Hines would call dissembled space?
mm,
That if we're dissembling and giving the appearance of compliance to certain demands to like dance, to jump, to do whatever,
mm,
um, that's to protect some kind of interiority within ourselves, but also intramurally. So
mm,
I think the article is like rape in the interior lives of Black women, and the point that Darlene Clark Hines makes is, as a historian, she's trying to look for a sense of interiority for Black women in the 19th century as they're migrating north. And she's like, I can't find it,
mm,
even as myself a Black woman.
mm,
That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but that means that these women are dissembling. Like they might be giving off the impression of compliance, but the reason they're doing that is they're trying to create another kind of space that can be held within themselves and amongst each other. Um,
yeah, I call that the elsewhere. That's yeah. Yeah.
yeah, I know. I think there's names for it elsewhere, undercommons, fugitive.
Undercommon.
I sometimes don't like some of those words because part
Mm-hmm.
of the argument that Clark Hines is making is that when we talk about that act of dissemblance, the critical um, onus in a way is to appreciate the labor of creating that other space.
And not
So
the space itself.
yes. And
Mm-hmm.
in fact, like, you and I can talk about the space, and we are all the time. Like, it's
Mm-hmm.
inside how we relate to each other. But, like, there are
Yeah.
cameras here, strangers are watching. So, it's like maybe we don't want to talk about that.
Mm,
Like, there's so
mm,
much co
mm.
optation going on now with. Between like AI surveillance, but also like the rhetoric of the far right, like there was deeply an incorporation of all of that pro-indigenous kind of activism in the aughts that then turned into like white indigeneity in the US with like weird Anglo-Saxon stuff. You see it
Yeah.
in like Europe where
Yeah.
maybe 10 years ago liberal politics or like good liberalism meant you were including Black people, but now it's like, oh, the indigenous people of Europe. And it's like, I'm not saying that Northern European indigeneity wasn't eradicated by colonialism, but they're white in a
Mm-hmm.
particular way.
Mm.
Um, and you see it in India also. The far right is now mobilizing the discourse of indigeneity to like authenticate or like
Mm.
certify. So that's all just to say, like, I agree with you that there's a number of ways we talk about this other space.
Yeah.
I have really strong hesitance about that other space's conversation making its way into a broader public circulation amongst strangers. Because that's the other thing that I understand about the lyric, too. Inside a lyric address, there's the intimate address, but also there's an address to a stranger. And so, in a way, maybe why I didn't want to talk about dance is I think inside of dance or like a kind of bodily proximity I have to people, like that's where I preserve what might be called the elsewhere space. I don't like undercommons because actually, like, I was thinking about undercommons the other day, and Candace Chu brought this to my attention. She's like, "Oh, what I noticed in that book is like, it's not actually trying to describe the other space. It's trying to understand, like, describe all of the administrative labor
Mm.
and communication technologies it takes to be able to create that space. Like, the undercommons is actually not like the elsewhere. The undercommons is like a account of labor."
It's like those data sets.
Mm-hmm.
Like that you thought that you didn't intend on studying in
Mm-hmm.
undergrad,
Mm-hmm.
but were a part of the the policy making regime, as it were, the management,
Mm-hmm.
the managerial.
Well, that's part of it is I often actually don't like to speak liberation
Mm,
publicly
mm,
to strangers. Like this is I have such resistance to the rhetoric and the form of the sermon. Um, Partially because I'm traumatized by it from growing up in Salt Lake City. There's Mormons, and then my mom joined like um, a Chinese Christian church when I was 12, and I have like a
mm-hmm.
vexed relationship to that, and I think she does too. There's also the reality that like my mom grew up in a communist labor camp because of Mao, and so like the voice of the radical or
Mm,
the sort of prophetic or the messianic, those are all things that I'm just like,
mm-hmm.
that's cute for some other people. For me, absolutely not.
Mm.
Um, so I don't
How
like
do
I.
you like identify that though? Like like what's the contours of that identification of a prophetic or um yeah, that kind of like
Hmm.
I mean for me it's just like oration, is it not? But I'm sorry, go
Yeah,
yeah.
no, I think it is like so many of my friends are black
Mhm.
that I understand for some other people there's a different relationship to it
Sure.
because, that's like, even as Sean Crawley's like Black Pentecostal breath, like inside of those erratic formations that on the surface appear to be so like normative, uplift, there's intense queerness. And that a lot of that intense queerness is actually the retention of certain Africanist idioms,
Mm.
of certain forms of spirit,
Mhm.
where gender has not been marshaled and disciplined into its colonial form.
Mm.
I don't have that experience. That's not the experience of my body. But like one, I guess, tell for me is if the voice of the messianic, um, which I think does help people liberate a sense of space and time and being from the narrows of like the political present and makes you aware of like there's something larger in terms of time and continuity of community and being. That's all fine, but then if there's no, how do I want to say this? If that kind of awareness is liberated, but then immediately commanded to latch on to a specific political project
Mm.
or a specific kind of agenda that the voice of the messianic has,
Mm.
that's when I think
It
there's a
becomes
problem. That's
problematic.
that's the difference I think between like the messianic as a kind of broader awareness that's about recovering the senses that whatever place you're in has tried to make you repress.
Mm.
The difference between that, which is the voice of a kind of liberation,
Mm.
um, like the dangerous thing that I find and the thing that turns me off is that is so close to the ideological.
Mhm. That it's just it becomes fictitious
Yeah,
or
it's like, let us free you from a bad construct of your energy. And I think, like, yeah, and then once that's freed, everybody individually has to work through, so what now? But
mm,
then if that community whose senses have been freed must then be immediately directed into something else, like Maoism, like the Mormon church, like the Christian church, like a particular version of blackness, a particular version of blackness that requires whitenesses like
approval.
approval, then I'm like, okay, now we're in a distortion. And I find that just so frequent that
Mm,
I avoid the messianic, I avoid the prophetic.
mm,
Particularly as that happens in the valence of language.
mm,
Like, I will still hold on to the space of one's body's ability to exude a sort of wisdom or knowledge that helps somebody else's body experience it,
mm,
but I don't want language all over it
mm,
because language is broader,
mm,
which is bad and good. Like, I'll do those things if I'm giving somebody like massage or adjustments in yoga because I know the bodies that are present. I have a like actual relationship to them in time and space.
mm-hmm.
But I don't want to bring that kind of sense opening into language because that's
You just
like
don't
so easy to
know.
get co-opted. English isn't my first language.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
I don't know who's looking into this. Language is like people play with it in a
yeah.
very unethical way.
Mm,
I've been
mm,
having conversations with my therapist about like, well, what's the difference between intention
mm,
and practice? And when I map that onto different kinds of like, let's be generous, like aspirational politics that fail, and
mm-hmm.
ungenerously like people who are co-opting, people who like to learn the language of healing to mobilize it towards violence.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm, mm.
Now language is all like theoretical language seems all aligned with intention. But then I'm like, so what's the language for practice then? Or what does accountability look like?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that was a bit like scattered, but I think broadly, maybe you understand a
Yeah,
certain hesitance
yeah.
I have around the lyric, the theoretical. I like those things, but I find that those are deeply politically suspect right now. And I don't think we should. Yeah, I just, there's something has gotten very broken around language, and that needs to be addressed
Yeah.
before jumping into the enchantment that certain kinds of languages can provide.
Yeah. Oh, that's a lot of stuff. I'm just like wanting to settle into that. Yeah, I mean, language, hmm, it's a messy space, it's a messy sphere, but we still have to use it, right? To engage, to attempt to, you know, strive for some kind of future, like, right? Or what else are we doing, you know?
I mean, part of it for me is understanding what are the forms of address that are going on, what are the space. Like, I'm talking to you now in a different way than like when we key or like when we're just by ourselves. And I think you'll know like we both use different language.
Mm,
Because in that
mm,
space, we have an established form of safety. We trust each other at a bodily level. We know each other's intentions. And actually, that for me is where the space of the lyric emerges. That's where you and I play
mm,
with language.
mm,
That's where we feel
mm,
loved and seen through
mm,
language. That's where we exchange ancestor or
mm,
wisdom through
mm,
language. But that's
mm.
not the conversation we're having now.
Exactly,
Because as I
exactly,
asked you, I was like, where does this
exactly,
circulate? Like, this
exactly.
might be on Vimeo. This might be
Yeah, yeah,
destined for the
yeah,
archive. I don't know
yeah,
who's looking at this.
exactly.
I feel protective of you and me. I feel protective of the Kim that teach me lyric language. And so
Mm.
I'm speaking in a more abstracted, formalized, critical language because this is happening in 2024. And at some level, I'm like, not everybody deserves the lyric.
Exactly, I will not give you all. No, I hear you 100%, and
Like, withholding needs to be done.
hey, I hear you, I hear you, I hear you. I respect you and respect everything that you're speaking to because yeah, it's truth. You know, it's truth. Um, I guess what question that's coming up for me is sort of how are you making sense of this complicated 2024, this moment of like so many different kinds of social optics, and like it can become almost discouraging to even produce anything in the public domain. So like how are you, yeah,
Well,
like,
here's the question. Is it
yeah.
even the public domain? It's not because it's been privatized.
Ooh. Oh,
Like the
exactly.
museum is not the museum, even as like we
Yes.
oppositionally and aspirationally want it to function like a public trust.
Yes.
That's not what the museum is. So that's not actually the public domain. That's a privatized space. The internet has become a privatized space. Like I was teaching my students like the Matrix, and we were talking about deregulation, and they were trying to, I don't think they were making this argument, but they were saying something about like the current form of the internet being deregulated to a degree, and it's because they had communication technologies like Reddit, and there was such, again, the optimism of the undercommons. And I
Yeah.
had to tell them, I'm like, no, no, no. Deregulation was me at like 11 playing Neopets, accidentally clicking a pop up, and like horrific porn, literal cascading on the computer screen. It was the Ghost Man, for anybody who remembers this, GOAST. The only way to make it stop was I had to unplug the computer. And they were mortified, and I was like, that's deregulation. That's the public domain.
Yes.
Like, Sam Delaney talks about this in Times Square Red, Times Square Blue. It's like,
Yes.
that's the space of the bathhouse. Like, it's very
Exactly.
terrifying to be in the real public domain. And I've been having this
Exactly.
conversation with a number of people about
Yeah.
trigger warnings where it's like, this doesn't work because, like, assault does not come with a trigger warning in real life. It's
Exactly.
not like I tell
I know.
the people who have assaulted me in the past, like, could we actually wait and schedule this for in a month and a half? Because I have
Exactly.
to turn my dissertation in. Like,
I mean, that's what you told me.
yeah. so, so one, the
Like, we're gonna
question.
put a pause.
Yeah. So the question is like, what is the public domain? Where
Yeah.
does it exist? Because all of the things that appear as the public domain are not that. Like even the internet.
100%.
Like
Exactly.
once Shoshana Zuboff writes about this in like the third stage of the internet. Once like Google became the biggest search engine because they realized that you could sell the data as an algorithm towards marketing, the internet is no longer the public domain.
I know. You are
So
absolutely
that's one of the
right.
ways I'm trying to make sense of this. Is there's a series of techniques for calling in community, for creating opposition that we have from 60s, 70s, even earlier on, but that assumes that the public domain exists. I don't know. I'm sure the public domain exists somewhere, but I think its scale is probably intimate now. Its scale is not the museum. Its scale is like you and me walking around looking for a joint and then being asked to donate to trees. And then having, afterwards I thought, I'm like, you know what we should have said to him? I should have been like, grass first, tree later.
Exactly.
But like in those moments, there's a
Yes.
kind of
Yes.
micro
I hear
public
you.
domain, and it's
100.
not, that's the other thing about the public domain, is it's not freely accessible.
Exactly.
There are checks because not everybody belongs to the same public.
Whew, that's a lot. That is. Ugh.
So
See,
that
you
was
making me cry again every time. Every time. Tears of joy, but.
and that
yeah.
is why we can't ask for trigger warnings.
Exactly. Oh my God. Dahlia. I mean, you always bring it. You bring it. You bring the truth. You bring. Yeah. Even if there is a kind of, I don't know, sense of protectedness and codedness. I mean, maybe because I feel you. I get your humor, maybe to a degree at least. So yeah. I'm just grateful that you are someone who, yeah, is in this world, and I'm able to just live alongside and do this work, however we can make sense of it.
Well, I was going to notice one thing, like maybe we have a certain overlap, which is that thing that for you exists. Let's talk about it through the sartorial. For you, it's cloaking. It's literally cloaking, but it's a cloaking that comes with its own textures, the fabrics, that there's an enjoyment inside of it. Like there's an aesthetic
100.
presentation of how you locate and defend
Yep.
or dissemble the elsewhere, and that actually is I have that also.
Mm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
well, actually, here's a fun game.
Yeah.
Based off of, well, you also know my sartorial style too. Like based off of my
Agree.
sartorial style, how
Yeah.
would you then describe um, my analogous relationship to the thing that you call cloaking?
Ooh, that's a good question.
Give her a read.
um. Hmm. I mean, what is coming up for me, which isn't particularly unique to you, I would
Mm-hmm.
say, because I noticed this. I would say it feels like a generational thing. Hate to
Mm.
put you a part of a generation, but
Which generation is that?
exactly
Alpha?
right. Exactly. Yes, the alpha generation. No, what's even younger than the alpha?
But I don't think they have a name for
They don't
that
have a
yet.
name for your generation.
Yeah.
But I think there's something about um, yeah. So like this idea of cloaking. How and when does the cloak come off? When is it released? Why and for
Mm.
whom? Um, and so I guess, yeah, for me, it feels like an energetic thing. It's like almost like it takes a while to, again, to sort of
Mm.
understand what is the formation that I'm operating in. And maybe once those sort of indicators, you've sort of landed, then a sense of ease might be able to arrive.
And that's something you find characteristic of millennials.
I
I mean,
mean,
Gen Alpha.
Gen Alpha, exactly. Why are you naming yourself?
I'm so young, I don't know generations well, so I get
Exactly,
confused.
yes.
Am I a boomer?
What am I? But yeah, it's something about, it's almost like, because again, the crush of capitalism and the world, New York City, just like all the things, it can harden. It
Mm-hmm.
hardens you. It hardens the body. It hardens, um, and I don't even think it's a read or it's no judgment. It's just something that I'm observing
Mm-hmm.
is like the time, the temporal signature of release and how
Mm.
long it sort of. But again, for bodies that have been colonized and are trying to. I know you don't like the word heal, but to recover,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Refined.
refine.
Refined with a D and refine with an E, I think is maybe my understanding of that thing
Mm,
that some other people would describe as healing.
okay.
Because for me, it's sort of like the refining.
Mm,
Because for millennials, like, we came of age under like a false sense of color blindness and optimism. So I
mm,
do think a lot of millennials bought
mm.
into these things that I was always kind of suspicious of because
Sure.
like my parents had fast food restaurants and it was like every 4 years there was an economic catastrophe that like fucked us over and then the
Your Lexus
mortgage
ain't
was
nothing
like
new.
maybe not it's like go back to work.
Mm,
So it's like that's why I've been working since I was 6.
mm.
Um,
I thought it was just because you were Chinese, but
I mean the same basically. Wait, say that again for the camera. What did you say about my people? What do you think about
I
the
just
Chinese?
gave you the read you were
What do you think about the
asking for.
Chinese?
I was just telling you.
What about the Chinese?
That you're hardworking?
Oh, okay. Well, and where did you get that idea from?
Oh, from my friend Dahlia.
What if I were adopted? But
I've
anyway,
seen your parents.
but the but the healing thing is sort of like for millennials. Why I say it's a refinding. It's finding out what is the reality.
Mm,
that the false narrative that you were fed covers over.
Refinding.
Yeah, because the other part of it is about queerness too. Is like we came of age right around the time PrEP and PEP happens. In the U.S., gay marriage gets legalized, so it's a reduction of queerness as like a coalitional, multi-ethnic, oppositional project into it's just your sexual choice. So for millennials, it's like all forms of difference are reduced to kind of, well, that's just a choice. Like the society can accommodate that, which actually was not the society. It was the market will incorporate it. So like show us your private domains in the public domain and then we'll corporatize it.
Yep.
So that's why I think so much about refinding for millennials. It's like, well, locate what actual history you came from before you arrived to the city, college, where you believed in a thing that was not true. And then once you've discovered what that lineage is, how do you refine it for its public circulation within the weird now private domain that we have? And particularly, I get this new sense, having taught more intensively for the last year, Gen Z students that are not cuspy like Zillennials, that are fully Gen Z. There's a necessary refinement because I think between the pandemic and like millennials just getting corporatized and believing in things that were not true, or like I can go to New York and I can just make it. Like if I just work hard enough, I'll get my break. And it's like, girl, that sounds like you're in 1930s in the Hollywood like industry. Like that's not what happens. But there's a necessary thing of like, as millennials, one has to refine where you actually came from and then refine it to figure out, so how are you going to transmit that to Gen Z? Because they're thirsty and they don't really know things.
Yeah.
Which is not their fault. Like the educational system failed them. They came of age in the pandemic.
Yeah.
Like all they know is crisis. So this is why I don't say healing.
Exactly. It's an impossible project in this day and age.
Or the conditions for healing have been dismantled, so we can't speak about it yet.
Oof. Well, on that note, it's been real. Thank you for checking in. You know, this is the Dahlia Li, Dr. Li.
This is Dahlia. This is why we can't have nice things.
This is why we can't. And why she always makes me cry, literally, like every time, because it's just it's like the truth, you know, it's the truth. But thank you, and thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
it's always special to share space with you.
I know.
Small
you
or
too.
big.
Exactly. I feel the same way. All right. Until next time.
Until next time.
Thank you.
It's probably when the cameras go off. But
exactly. Yeah.
The real conversation.
Exactly. Now we can really kiki. Now we're about to really let it out. So, bye. No, bye.